And we are recording, which you can tell because you see a little red dot over here. So thank you all for coming on out for Pub-Theology tonight. We are taking on quite the big topic. I don't know if you all saw the topic we're taking on tonight. Hopefully you did. And like I said, in Pub-Theology, I will take on anything. You file a question with me, it is on the ballot until we vote it off the ballot. The only way to vote it off the ballot is to go ahead and have class on it. So if there is any question about anything, know that we will take it on, from serious questions like tonight's all the way to could zombies and vampires be saved, which we have literally done. I am not making a joke. That was actually one of them. Marianne, you were there, right? Joe, you were there too, I think, for that one. That was back in pre-COVID land. We actually met at a pub. Yep. All right, so why don't we go ahead, unless you have any questions, we're going to dive right in tonight. Does that sound good for y'all? All right. Yes. So now I got to see if I can remember how to share the screen. All right. So far, so good. So I'm going to minimize you all because it records everything, including all y'all's faces, which makes it hard for folks later to see things. But that does mean that I will require that you as adults, if you have a question, will simply interrupt me and know that I like being interrupted. And you just take my word for it, okay? Because I'm an extrovert, and the best thing ever is when someone talks to me and I can then talk to them. And it goes back and forth.
Hey, Matt, can you tell us what each of those letters mean?
We are actually going to do that. That is where we start, because it has gotten to a point where I think it's hard for folks to know that. So let's go ahead and we will start the slideshow. All right, so the question is, should the LGBTQIA plus community or communities, there's a controversy on how you say that, and I will go for whatever offends the least number of folks, be accepted in the church to worship God? Why or why not? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to start right where I think we should start off the bat, which is, let's make sure we understand the question itself. And to me, there are two really critical parts of the question. The first part of the question is we need to understand what the LGBTQIA plus communities are and make sure we know sort of who are we talking about, okay? And then we also need to have a quick conversation of what does accepting mean? Because I think sometimes I've seen fights over this happen, and it really isn't an issue over people fighting about the right or the wrongness or the morality or the ethics, but it's really over what is accepting. So I just want to make sure that we sort of look at that too, that will be a much briefer part of it, because I think it's far less important than understanding what communities we are and what the Bible says about it. So we're going to talk for a decent amount of time about what are these different communities. Then we're going to talk about what the Bible sort of has to say on one side or the other about the communities. And then we'll take on a few things, and then I'm going to pose it back to you guys because I think this is a super important question. So there are numerous spectrums that we're actually talking about when we say LGBTQIA+, okay? So you're talking about a spectrum of sex, a spectrum of gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, romantic orientation, and the sort of ace or asexual spectrum. Full disclosure, I did not make up any of these definitions. I went to the Reconciling in Christ Toolkit, which you can find on this hyperlink if you want, or if you want me to send you the link, I can send it to you. They are a sort of mostly inner Lutheran, though they're technically intra-Lutheran, so they work with different Lutheran groups and even with different denominations, but mostly within Lutheranism. Sort of help working with congregations on becoming congregations that are accepting to the LGBTQIA communities. So I figured, since they also represent those communities often in different circumstances, in different synods and stuff like that, they would be a good place to go for the definition of what these communities are, right? Because who am I to define somebody else? You know what I mean?
Yes, we know what you mean. You probably can't see us nodding.
Oh, I cannot see you nodding. Sorry, my screen like froze. We'll try going again forward. There we go. All right. So let's talk about sex, because we know that's what us Lutherans want to do every day, right? That doesn't make us squirmy at all to say that. So when we use the definition for this conversation today about sex, we're talking about what is assigned at birth insofar as your external genitalia, reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormones, these sort of very scientific way. Okay, I know that most of us, when we use this word, mean it in a completely different context. But when we're talking about it in this context, we're basically talking about the people's biological anatomy. Okay, and within that, there are basically three-ish definitions that you'll find. People are female, people are male, people are intersex. Okay, so somewhere in between through any number of reasons. Okay, and so when we talk about male, female, or intersex, we are talking among a spectrum of sex, in other words, biological. Okay, this has nothing, by the way, to do with sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity. We'll get to those in a minute. So sexual orientation, this is probably the next one we're most used to talking about. So sexual orientation describes which gender or genders someone is physically or emotionally attracted to. We're going to get into that physical, emotional stuff later on because that's its own spectrum. Okay, therefore, when you're in this sort of group, you're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, or straight are all different examples of sexual orientations. So when you think about it, you're really talking some sort of spectrum of folks who are attracted to men, or folks who are attracted to, or folks who are bisexual or pansexual or queer or attracted to women. Okay. Now, I probably use some terms that at least I would have to look up to know the exact differences. You guys are probably smarter than I am, but just so we're all on the same page, bisexual is someone who is an identity term describing the physical or emotional attraction to people of more than one gender, so both male and female. Pansexual identifies a term describing the physical or emotional attraction to people of any gender. You may say, now hold on, how would that be? Well, a bisexual would say I'm attracted to men and women, where a pansexual may also be attracted to someone who has different gender identities, where a bisexual may not. Okay. So for example, if you have a man who identifies as a woman, a pansexual would be willing to date, where a bisexual might not. And I'm just saying might not, just from a very definitionary standpoint. Okay. So that's sort of where because a lot of people say, well, hold it, what's the difference? Well, that's the sort of difference that we're getting at. It's worth noting, so queer is a whole unique sort of thing. It sort of stands outside the spectrum. Often people who use that will mean bisexual or mean pansexual. Queer often is an academic term that will refer to queer theology or queer theory, which is a more academic term. So it is sort of a term that could mean bisexual, could mean pansexual, and is frankly a much older term. But it's still out there and important to folks. Yeah, Carolyn, you asking a question?
No, you got.
Oh, sorry. I can sort of hear something, and sometimes I don't always hear folks. So, all right. So, gender identity. Okay. Gender identity refers to the person's innate, deeply felt psychological identification as either a woman, a man, or another gender altogether, which may or may not correspond with their sex. They were assigned at birth. So you could be biologically male, but your gender identity could be female or inverse or any number of other possibilities. And so when you're talking sort of things of gender identity, then you're really talking about someone could be male or female or gender fluid or gender queer or gender non-binary. Okay. Wow. And this has to do with how they perceive their internal gender.
Okay.
Okay. So gender nonconforming or non-binary or gender queer can describe someone who doesn't express their gender identity and or gender expression in a way conforming to normal social or cultural norms. Non-binary people may also identify as in between somewhere. These genders could be both genders, neither gender, or as identified as a different gender altogether.
Yes, my great granddaughter identifies as neither sex.
As what?
I have a great granddaughter
Mhm.
who, well, a great granddaughter who thinks she might be male but identifies as neither sex.
Okay. So that would be, so in gender identity terms, she could be either non-binary or neither sex, which is sort of in the same zone usually. Or gender non-conforming.
Asexual, right?
Okay, asexual is a different whole thing because asexual has to do with sexual attraction, which we haven't actually gotten to yet, but that is definitely a thing. Okay, so which is different than gender expression. Those can be independent of each other. So
got it.
Moving on to gender expression. Oh, yes, Gail. Okay. So gender expression refers to the external characteristics or behavior that are socially defined either as masculine or feminine, such as dressing, grooming, mannerisms, speech patterns, social interactions, culture. Gender expression has wide varieties, right? So one is, do I feel that I am male or female internally? Okay, that's gender identity. Gender expression is, do I live into society's definition of being effeminate, masculine, androgynous, somewhere on that spectrum, okay? Because you could identify one way and you can express another way. You follow sort of the difference? Any questions on that? I mean, a lot of these, especially if we haven't encountered them before, can be really confusing for folks.
Very confusing, but
Okay. Few quick definitions. So transgender comes from the Latin word cross. Someone who's transgender has crossed from the gender assigned at birth to a different gender identity. So we're in gender identity, not gender expression, as a way of practicing hospitable sort of curiosity. It's important to remember that transgender persons' bodies belong to them, and we should always just note we don't have the right to ask if or how they are seeing any medical treatments. I know like sometimes people will be super curious about this, but we wouldn't do that. You wouldn't come up to me and say, hey, how'd your colonoscopy go, Matt? So we really shouldn't be like digging into people's personal medical stuff, Just thing to note out there. Cisgender, by the way, is just a slightly different. So transgender means you've crossed your assigned gender does not match. Someone will say like, I'm cisgender. That just means that their gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth. So they were born male, they identify as male, they're therefore cisgender, okay? Because the identity and the sex assigned at birth line up, but that's really not the best way of putting it. So let's talk the romantic orientation spectrum. So the aromantic or aro, which is I think what you're talking about earlier, Rich, is an orientation characterization by the lack of romantic attraction towards any gender, okay? In other words, aro is short for aromantic. Romantic is an orientation characterized by a romantic attraction towards any particular gender. Now, it could be, I am a cis male. I am attracted to females, okay, to women. So, and I am attracted both romantically and sexually. So romantically, meaning I want an emotional connection as part of a lifelong relationship. Therefore, I would be romantic. If I was a person, I could be male, I could be cis, but if I was never interested in any sort of emotional connection, then I would be aromantic. Okay, now this is different than asexual, and just like any of these, there's going to be a spectrum where the amount of emotional connection for the person to be satisfied is going to be different. And I think, like, to me, I've known a lot of folks, I've counseled a lot of folks in marriage counseling. There's a lot of folks out there who they would very quickly acknowledge they and their spouse have very different concepts of how romance should look. Right?
Right.
Like, it is one of the most argued about things in relationships, in marriages ever, is how much romance should the relationship have. Okay. Okay. So this really isn't like a, oh, what'd you say, Lisa?
What is defined as romance to each partner, you know?
Right.
Right. The amount of it, but then what is the definition of it to each of them? They may think that their definition is what they've always been doing, you know, for or with the partner, and the other partner may not agree with that. But anyway.
Absolutely. Right. And like a great book, The Love Languages, sort of talks about different ways in which people accept and give and show love. And that's really what we're talking about when we use the word romance here. Okay. And the reality is, everyone's somewhere on that spectrum, right? Okay, this isn't a radical, crazy idea. I could have gone to my now long past grandfather, and if I remember talking to him, he had been a priest, an Episcopal priest for years and years and years, and he always used to comment, yeah, romance is one of the biggest things people fight about. Now, he was a silent generation guy, but he would have acknowledged that. My dad has been a Episcopal priest for a number of years. He'd be the first one to say, oh yeah, he's a baby boomer. He says, oh yeah, people have been fighting about romance my entire career too as a pastor. So again, this isn't like, so I always like to stop here because I think this is one of the places everyone who's been in a relationship can relate to. But the definition of romance, how much connection people want differs from person to person. And we're all sort of on a spectrum on that sense, right? And I stop here because what all these terms are trying to do is to give terminology to lived human experiences. Okay. I know a lot of times people go, oh, these weird academics, they keep coming up with these new terms and then new groups and with all these new ideas. But like, this term is one I bet you all of us have lived with, where our girlfriend, our boyfriend, our spouse, whatever, our partner has had a different concept of romance than us at one point or another. Or we did something we thought was romantic that our spouse completely missed. Right?
So we wouldn't put this in the same, so we wouldn't put this, showing our love to a friend, we wouldn't put that in the category of romance though, right?
No, this has to do with when you're in a relationship.
Oh,
they're sort of saying, and we're going to get to, you're going to have sort of sexual attraction and emotional attraction.
Okay.
Okay. And so we're talking about the emotional side at this moment. We're going to talk about the sexual side in a second. Okay.
Got it. Emotional. Okay. Got it.
Okay. And again, most of us have been in relationships, or at least seen relationships, where one of those two got way out of balance. Okay. You know, we've all known that guy who dates that girl that you're just like, how can you stand her? And the guy goes, she's super hot, which is not a good answer. Okay. That guy has a very low romantic bar. Okay. Now this, like all these other things, change over time. Okay. And I always like to stop at this because I think this is one that if we can sort of get our minds around and realize like this is just a description of things that are happening, and then say, you know, all the other ones, all these other spectrums are just a description of things that are happening. These aren't new. They're just new ways of describing a thing that's always been. Okay. I just like to stop and remind folks of that. All right, moving on to asexual, or ace, is sexual orientation characterized by a lack of sexual attraction towards any gender. Ace is short for asexual, just like bi is short for bisexual, or trans short for transgender. And in this case, again, you'd have someone who enjoys and finds fulfillment in sexual expression on one end, and another person who finds no joy or fulfillment in sexual expression on the other, and then people who are in between. Again, many of you have probably experienced that there is different opinions as to the level of sexual activity and what is enjoyed, and please do not go into details for me, when in sexual relationships, okay? And that has been true since the beginning of time, okay? And so this is just language that people are trying to empower folks with to talk about that, okay? Any questions so far before we move into what the Bible says about this? Because we as Lutherans should always stop by the Bible first when thinking through something. I'm going to move you guys back to the bigger grid here for just a minute.
I have a question, Matt.
Absolutely.
You've mentioned in passing that there's some variability to attraction, but over a period of time when two people might be attracted to each other, there can be a wide variation in the quality and quantity of attraction that changes over a lifetime. So
Correct.
I don't know if there's a word for that.
Well, and that would be the gray A scale, because most folks at some point will have a higher or lower emphasis on the sexual attraction as an important part or aspect of a relationship and the fulfillment in which they get from it. And in many of these, you'll find that there is a certain fluidity to any of these spectrums. It's not just a fluidity.
That's what the gray is for.
Right. So someone might say I'm gray A, meaning I float around the middle. And it gets more complicated. We're going to need a few more definitions, but there also be folks who'll say I have to have one before I have the other. I have to have a deep emotional connection before I would ever enjoy a sexual connection.
Yeah, I understand.
And again, that's just a description. And I've met people of every generation that would be like, yeah, that sounds like you, or no, that doesn't. You know what I mean? Like, again, these are just descriptions that academics are trying to introduce to give us language so we can speak about different realities that's always really been.
Okay.
Okay. All right. You guys ready to move forward? All right.
Let's go forward.
All right. So what does the Bible say about it? Okay. So first thing, massive disclaimer. This is going to be a very shallow dive into a number of very deep ponds. Okay. I could easily do an entire semester focus of an adult education curriculum if you all wanted to. By the way, since I'm the person who sets the adult educational curriculum, if that is something you all want, it is something we could do and really do a deeper dive. So there is going to be a lot of things I'm going to leave out on all sorts of sides of these arguments, all sorts of nuances I'm going to skip over. That is not because of unawareness about them. That is not because they are not important. It is simply that this could be a 14-part course if we wanted to make it that, okay? So just stop me if you want to dig into something, because I'm going to be like overtly shallow in my hits in the Bible, okay? Y'all follow? So that's my disclaimer. So what does the Bible say about sex? Well, I do always like to remind people before we start into this that we are no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male or female, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. Okay? Folks usually like to start with something I like to start with something that's a little bit different on that. While there has been a history of Christians opposing, we're talking about sex, remember? So you have male, female, intersexed. Opposing or oppressing intersexed and women, okay? This is seldom justified through the Bible, at least insofar as oppression through sex. Now there's oppression of women through gender, oppression of intersex folks through gender, that there's long histories of, okay? But you haven't found a long history of finding a place in the Bible in which people would argue women are just evil. Period. End of story. It's worth noting the one place you will find that is the Gospel of Thomas. So all those folks who want to bring the Gospel of Thomas in, you do not want to. It is overtly hates women. So much so that Mary only gets to heaven after Jesus gives her a sex change.
Oh, gee.
Okay, it's at the
Whoa.
end of the Gospel of Thomas. It's a weird thing. There's a reason it didn't make it in the Bible.
There's a reason even in 350 or whenever they decided what's in and what's out, that they decided that was even just too wacky for them, huh?
Exactly. These are the people who let the book of Revelation in, thought that was too weird. Okay.
Wow.
Well, they let
So-
the sexy parts in too. What is it? The Song of Solomon or whatever?
Song of
Stuff,
Solomon,
right?
man, they let that in, and that is literally erotic poetry.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we're putting the pub and Pub-Theology night, guys. All right, so yeah. So it's just every so often people get on these little like, why do they keep these books out? There are often really good reasons. That is a really good reason to keep out the Gospel of Thomas, because it literally says women can't be saved unless they become men. Okay. So moving on. So when we start talking about sexual orientation, this is the one where people will come in with, boom, Bible's against it, and this is why. And they go Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Romans 8, 1, 1832, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, 10, Timothy 1, 8 through 10. Okay? That's what they'll come in with and say, these are definitive. Can't do it. But when we dig a little deeper, it at least becomes more questionable. Why? Let's take the Old Testament one, so the Leviticus one and the Sodom and Gomorrah one. So first of all, Leviticus is a series of ancient laws. Most of them we don't follow. So one of the questions that should be asked is simply, okay, so why are we picking these 2 lines, but not the 40 lines before or the 120 lines after? Okay, which I think is a legitimate question we should ask ourselves. Now, granted, there are Christians who are called Chaldeanians that follow all of Leviticus, and then they would say, I follow all those. But Lutherans do not, and there are virtually no Christians that do. Okay, because to do that would mean you would not be able to eat pork. To do that would mean you could not go ahead and have fabrics that are made of more than one fabric. To do that would mean you cannot put cheese on a brat. You can't have a brat if there's pork in it.
Wait, no broom, right? No pork.
Okay, right? Like everything at Miesfeld's all of a sudden is not okay. Which
No shrimp,
I can't
no
sign on to.
lobster.
What?
No shrimp, no lobster, right?
Oh yeah, no shrimp, no lobster, no shellfish at all.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that, and there's like 21 ways in which you are allowed to kill your children. Yes, including disobedience, which I know, Kate, it sounds like a great idea when your kid's like 3, but probably really isn't.
Probably not a great idea.
Probably not a great idea. Now, granted, another one of them is worshiping the god Baal, but again, also that one probably doesn't catch as many kids. Still, also probably not a great idea. Not exactly in the vein of humanism right there. So I think to me that's a really big question. Is why pick out these? Now I will tell you that evangelicals will respond by saying, well, the sexual sins are somehow more sinful than other sins. With that said, if we believed that, we would still have very different marriage laws, because there's a number of things that are legal in the US that are not with Leviticus, because Leviticus has very stringent who you can marry and how old you have to be married laws. So for example, Most of the states in the South will allow you to marry a first or a second cousin. That's absolutely forbidden in Leviticus. And so I always push back against the evangelicals and say, hey guys, you guys are concentrated down even in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia. Why the heck aren't you fighting these laws? Because that's where they are most prevalent in the US. Okay. So I think there is a little bit of a question of, again, why these over others? And by the way, what made sexual laws of Leviticus more important than dietary laws or temple laws or laws about how to pray or laws about how to parent or laws about any number of other things? Because Leviticus covers every part of daily life, as does Deuteronomy. So to me, I think there's a legitimate question there. Now, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, I don't buy for 1 second has anything to do with homosexuality. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, in a nutshell, is that you have a horrible cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Social order has collapsed. You have gangs of folks who walk around raping people. Okay? 2 angels of the Lord come down. They meet with Lot, who is a holy man who lives there. Okay? That he sees these 2 strangers wander into the city, and he knows that the rape gangs are going to attack them because they are foreigners. And that is the target of these gangs. So he goes to them and says, what are you idiots doing? You have to come back to my place because the gangs will attack and rape you because that's what they do the minute sunfall comes and you guys don't have a place to stay. Let me take you in. The gangs hear about the foreigners. They go to the door. They start slamming and saying, I want to attack and assault and rape these guys. Okay. Sodom and Gomorrah isn't about homosexuality. Sodom and Gomorrah is about sexual assault. It's about
But
rape.
he offered his daughters instead.
Yeah, and that did not end well if you keep reading.
Right.
Okay? Like Lot is not a good guy. Like, he does this one good act of saying, like, I want to save you from these gangs. But he's not a good guy. And part of the story, part of the whole overarching discussion of who Lot is that Lot starts off a righteous man, goes and lives in unrighteous cities because he has had a dispute with his brother Abraham over who gets to use what wells to take care of their farms. They've had a dispute between the 2 of them over water rights. He moves on to these cities because he won't make up with his brother and figure it out, and ends up living among folks who are really morally questionable, which slowly erodes his sense of morality. And any of you who know what happens after they escape really eroded his daughter's sense of morality. If you don't know that story, when you are in an adult-only situation, Google the story of Lot's daughters. Okay? Because even Pub-Theology, I'm hesitant to go there and think of all the things I've already said tonight. Okay? Now everyone is now Googling. No one is listening to me. They're all Googling Lot's daughters. What the heck happened? Okay. So no, seriously, that's the whole story. So I would really push back and say this has nothing to do with homosexuality. It has everything to do with why sexual assault and rape is horrific and bad, and we as Christians are called to speak out and uproot and get rid of that sort of violence. Okay? Because that's the violence that has occurred and still continues to occur, and it's horrible. But I can get on my high horse. I'll keep going. When you go to the New Testament, so remember the 3 New Testament ones, there are 2 New Testament words that are used, malakos, and I should have practiced this, ersokonati. I probably just butchered it. There's a Greek professor somewhere crying. Okay. So it's worth knowing that the malakos word is often used in Greek texts of the time. particularly military texts, and it refers to people who are effeminate. Now, effeminate had a major implication in the Greco-Roman word, so it isn't even a perfect match to what we think of as effeminate. In the Greco-Roman world, anything female was a highly patriarchal system. And so literally most of your Greco-Roman religions viewed that men were good and women were bad. Men were strong, women were weak. Men were moral, women were iffy. Okay? You read people like Plato, you read people like Socrates, and you can just hear the sort of misogyny that that culture had. Okay? So when they're using effeminate, what they're talking about is men who are morally weak, like a woman. Okay, there's the misogyny, right? Okay. Okay. And that's what they're going for. So often they're talking about folks who are just sort of morally, again, there's a good description, but we've all sort of met that person that you're just like, the second you can get away with doing something wrong, you're going to do it, aren't you? Or the second it is that path is easier, regardless of how moral it is, you're going down it, right? Like we've all had like that person we have run into. That is more what that word is used for, especially in the different texts you find historically. Arsenokonti is used in a list of vices. Now, this one is used very seldom, and we don't have a lot of other evidence of it used. It's only used here in the Bible in two cases, and it's only used in a handful of legal documents from the same time period. Okay, so it's this really narrowly used word. What we know is that the vices that they're used in a list of vices or sins, but these are ones that are often under the categorical heading of something that is both economic and sexual in nature. So it's usually in a list not with like, don't have an affair. It's usually in a list with things like, don't traffic humans, don't participate with prostitutes, don't erisanokoti. Okay, which makes people have to step back and go, okay, why would homosexuality be on that list rather than like affairs and incest and assault? Like, why isn't it on this list? Which is why when you read early Bibles or Bibles from those time periods, what you often find is a reference to temple prostitution. Now, there was a lot of same gender temple prostitution, which is what they might have very well been getting to because you paid for your prostitute at the temple by giving your money to the church. Okay. And obviously, as with any case of prostitution, there's a huge amount of economic exploitation and sexual exploitation that then occurs. Okay. This is why in both cases, neither of these get interpreted as homosexual or as homosexual acts or sodomy or anything even along that line until the 1940s or 1950s. Okay, because prior to the 1940s and 1950s, you do not find this in many Bibles. Now, there are a handful that go back a little bit earlier, maybe as early as like 1900, but think about it. The Bible is written like between 33 and like the 250s, 350s AD, and we're not interpreting this word this way until the 1900s. Okay. Yeah. People often ask why was there a sudden change? And again, I had a whole nother one where we really dug into what all the different changes look like. But it really starts to change when psychoanalysis is born, because we follow the science of psychoanalysis down the road of believing that homosexuality is somehow deviant, which is what initially Freudian psychoanalysis, which was sort of the standard bearer around 1900, would have taught. So honestly, I think the lesson for us as a church is just some hesitancy in sciences that are less sciencey, like psychology. Just maybe having a little bit of, well, let's see where psychology falls over time. I need to switch my headphones because I just got the low battery warning. So give me just a second. I apologize for that. Okay, I'm back. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
You can? Okay. Just one more second because I'm having trouble hearing you. All right. So, are there examples of non-heterosexual relationships in the Bible? The answer is, by the way, there are two possible.
Pastor Matt,
Samuel,
you are coming across pretty quiet right now.
and also, by the way, 2 Samuel does leave open a legitimate interpretation that there is something on there, something going on.
Pastor
the
Matt.
difference is that the Bible says that
You're very quiet, or you're not, you can't hear your voice at all.
Not really at all.
sorry, I'm being told I need to do a mic test because my mic's not working. Can you all hear me?
Now it's better.
Still not great.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. The wonders of Zoom in the time of Corona. So David, so you have David and Jonathan's relationship where it literally says David loved Jonathan as a man loves a woman. Okay. And there's multiple times where the two of them have these moments where someone walks in and they're talking to David and then Jonathan walks out of the bedroom. Okay. So it leads at least to a possibility of interpreting. Now people say, well, now hold on, back then, wasn't it normal that men slept in the same bed? Yes, that was culturally normative. You would see that with people like Alexander the Great, though there's questions about him too. What? I heard something.
Yeah, there's questions about him too. Yeah. No. Alexander the Great, yes.
There
yes.
is. He had some special friends.
Yeah. Yes. He was on a
Um
spectrum. He was on his own spectrum.
okay, like those of you who are students of history know what I'm referring to. But then you also have Ruth and Naomi. Here's one of the things. As one of the most used options at weddings is, do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Where your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you, or until death do us part is another way of interpreting that. Okay, we read that at weddings all the time. Ruth is saying that to Naomi. Okay, so I think it's at least reasonable to say that you could interpret that there is something other than friendship, something other than relationship going on. Now you could also say, no, these are two women who care deeply about each other. We have a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law in this circumstance. We're purely talking about not romance, but the love of a familial relationship, which is also a legitimate interpretation. Okay, but it means that you do have places in the Bible that can be interpreted one way or the other, which leaves open the idea that at least the Bible isn't clearly on one side or the other. So what does the Bible say about gender identity and expression? Biblical arguments against gender identity or expression generally fall into two categories. One series of arguments will say God made male and female. Okay, therefore there's male and female and everything else is just silliness or wrong or bad or whatever. Okay, that's one sort of arena of arguments against it. The other one is to note that God assigns roles to women and men. They would then point to things like, women should be obedient to their husbands, or that they should not teach in the temple, or any number of those sorts of things there. We've probably heard that.
On the other hand, so that's the arguments against. Now, it's worth noting we as the ELCA rejected at least those arguments against women when it comes to ordination and when it comes to a whole slew of things. We've already had that fight and definitely came clearly down saying, yeah, the Bible says some stuff, but there's interpretive issues there. On the other side of it, you do have other stories. For example, you have the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob is gendered female in comparison to Esau. If you talk about gender expression, right? Esau is a hairy, big, strong hunter dude. Jacob is a smooth, hairless guy who is slender built, and he doesn't go hunting. He stays in the tent and cooks with his mother. Okay? So when we're talking about gender expression, those are things that would normally be seen as female, right? Not male. And yet Jacob is picked by God to be the patriarch of all of his people, not Esau. Deborah, who is her own prophetess in the Bible, is a judge. Like, she is a judge selected by God due to her wisdom and her ability to foresee what is in the hearts of humans and make the hard, crucial decisions when they need to be made. Okay? Own sort of Iron Lady. That is definitely masculine, but Deborah is clearly female. So you could say, well, God didn't have a problem with Jacob. God didn't have a problem with Deborah. We also know that we have female pastors, hello, Dorcas and Lydia and many others, that are at least as much a pastor as Paul is, because he uses the same language to refer to them that he refers to himself as. So if you believe Paul's a pastor or that he's the Pope, then by golly, you should believe that Dorcas and Lydia are equivalents. You also have emissaries in Romans and Philemon, or Philippians, sorry, that show up that are female, that proclaim the gospel and proclaim the gospel perfectly. Now, they are not listed in the same way Paul is. They're listed as emissaries, whatever the bejeebers that means. But they are said that they do perfectly proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ to the communities that they are sent by God to preach to. We would consider them word and service, so maybe deacon. Okay. But those were in that culture considered masculine, and yet God called them to this masculine thing. Oops. Okay, romantic orientation and the ace spectrums. So this is folks who are maybe not romantically or not sexually attracted to anyone or somewhere on a spectrum, okay? It's worth noting, Paul never marries, nor does Paul have children. It's not just that he doesn't. If you read him, he is like, dude, I am celibate. It is amazing, and I love it. You should do that too. There is no need for you to marry to make it to heaven. God loves us all. All over his writings, stuck randomly all over the darn place. That would have been really bizarre for that time period. But it would be consistent with someone who is not attracted to anybody. Someone who's asexual, or maybe also aromantic. Because he doesn't seem to want, there's no sense that he is looking for any romantic or emotional connection. I mean, from everything everyone writes about Paul, he's a great preacher, but he's sort of annoying. He even preached so long as to kill somebody out of boredom in the Bible. Look it up.
That's right.
So one time he resurrects someone. The only time Paul gets to resurrect someone is when he killed them by preaching the most boring sermon in history. 4 hours long. Cautionary tale to all preachers. Okay. Celibacy in the early church was never required. So I'm not talking about what we see in Catholicism, okay? But it was also never looked down upon. You had celibate preachers in the early church all over the darn place. One of the reasons, there are political reasons that celibacy becomes required in the Catholic Church, but through all that time before it gets required, there were celibate and non-celibate priests running around all over the place. It's worth noting, Lutheranism, even our most conservative Lutheran brethren, do not ban you from being a celibate pastor. You can be a celibate Wisconsin Lutheran pastor if you want to. It's probably not good for your career, but there's nothing prohibiting it. Okay? And there never has been. Now, I don't think you should take one and lift it above the others, which is why I think the Catholics are wrong to do that, and some of our Eastern Orthodox brethren are wrong to do that, but we shouldn't do the opposite either. Okay? We shouldn't lift one as better than the other. They're just different, and that's cool. It's also worth noting, this always gets me in trouble when I point it out, but you know me, if I see trouble, I got to jump in it. Just noting, Jesus was 33, never married, never had romantic interest in anyone. Yes, you could try to read in some sort of romance between him and Mary Magdalene. A lot of folks since 1964 have attempted to do that. But, as a queer theologian once pointed out, that the same mental jumps you have to take to make him go out with Mary Magdalene, you could make him go out with John. So I'm interpretation.
I think he was a rebel and he went out with the lady from the well. You know that. He jumped the bottom of that girl.
Well,
I'm just saying, I think if there's no really good evidence that he goes out with anyone, so that is probably the most reasonable interpretation, is that he isn't dating, that he doesn't marry.
Right.
But
Now,
on the other
there's all
hand,
sorts of spiritual reasons as part of the reasons he's all divine, all human. Okay, fine. But that also leaves open interpretation here. That maybe he had no interest.
how would a good Jewish boy not be married by age 30? His parents would have found somebody.
Yeah. I forget
Yeah.
the Yiddish name for it, but like there are people you pay to get your kid married.
Yep.
Matchmaker is matchmaker.
Yeah, matchmaker, but there's a Yiddish word for it.
Mm-hmm. No.
Yeah, probably.
So it's just, a few things worth noting along that line. So before we get to one way or the other. Now, acceptance. We're getting near the end here. I'm glad you're hanging with me. So acceptance, historically, it's important to look at the differences in each group. It's important to note that there's a spectrum. Acceptance itself is a spectrum. I think it's super important that we sort of talk about this for a second, because it is really easy in today's political environment to try to say you're either this or you're that. Okay? And yet, in almost every political discussion, whether or not it has anything to do with LGBTQIA plus communities, there's usually at least 3, if not 17 billion answers, right? And lots of grays in between the two sides. So when we're talking about stuff like this, yes, there are humans out there, and unfortunately there are Christians out there who go into the realm of condemnation, who would look at folks on any of these spectrums and with hate in their hearts, say you are an abomination. Okay. It's worth noting we as Lutherans do not do that, or at least we as ELCA Lutherans do not do that. Okay. And that was a decision long before 09. Okay. Long before that discussion. Okay. We said, no, we do not condemn folks. And then it's not just that we don't condemn LGBTQIA folks or QIA plus folks. We don't go around condemning people to hell, because who are we to know, right? Okay. That's long in our roots. We don't go down the condemnation route ever. Okay. On the opposite end, you have acceptance, like complete acceptance, like these people are absolutely equal. They're children of God, and we should embrace them fully for the children of God that they are. But most churches, if they're honest with themselves, is somewhere between limited participation and tolerance. Okay, limited participation is like, you can come, you can get communion, which, by the way, you are required to offer. ELC Lutheran churches cannot, on the basis of anything we talked about today, deny communion or baptism. And if they try to, someone should call their bishop, and their bishop should call them out on it. Okay, so that's not even in the playbook of something ELC churches do. Okay, You can be a member. You cannot take membership away. Okay, this cannot be a thing that keeps your membership away. It cannot keep you out of a grave. It cannot keep you out of a graveyard. It cannot keep you out of a columbarium. It cannot keep you off of a committee. Okay. All that was decided long before 09. Okay. Why? Because we don't remove people from membership unless they're not a member, which usually is some combination of give a certain amount and commune a certain amount. By the way, just in case you're wondering, it's any amount of money and once a year. And you maintain your membership. That's our 2 requirements of First United, just for anyone who's watching. And then say, I want to become a member, and we'd love you to go through our membership classes, but you don't technically have to. There's my pitch. We will still let you join. And even if you don't meet those requirements, we never check them, so who knows? Okay. So, but it's definitely not sexual orientation. That's not a thing that any ELCA church, conservative or liberal, does or should be or is technically allowed to do. Okay. Now, tolerance is different than acceptance. Tolerance is saying, you know, I'm cool that that church in Vermont is doing that thing because it's okay for those Vermonters to do, but we live in Sheboygan, or we live in Nebraska. And here in Nebraska, things are different. Okay. So you might have tolerance, but that's going to be different than acceptance. You follow? And so that
Yep.
is, I think, the actual discussions that people need to be having is with the evidence we have of the Bible, one way or the other, where on that continuum are we? Where should we be? What should we be working towards, if anything? And those are the conversations that should be continuing to happen. All right, I'm going to stop. I think that's my last slide. Yep, that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop the share and come back to you guys. And then I was going to stop recording, but I don't know. I want y'all's thoughts. What are your thoughts on these things? You are the church. You have the power to make anything happen in the church.
Well, we were just reading the word in season
Yeah.
for today. The Lord God includes everyone, gathers the outcasts of Israel. He heals the brokenhearted. God has always gathered outcasts to build up community, leaving no one behind. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what we're saying is that if Jesus can have sinners and tax collectors, for crying out loud, then we should be allowing any person who wants to be a member of our church to be a full member, active in any aspect of our church life.
As long as they don't, the answer is yes, and that was long before 09. The only technical 2 amendments to that would be you can deny if you think they are only doing it as a means of scandalizing the community. Okay. Or if they are a clear and present danger to themselves or others because of the job they have. So those are the 2 lines, which in the discussions we're having, I don't think either one of those come into play. But those are the only 2 ones. In fact, those are, by the way, the only reasons I can deny someone communion. So if I ever came to you and said, you know what, that's it, Lisa, no communion for you. You call Paul Erickson on the phone, you say, Matt wouldn't give me communion. And then he would call me, by the way, probably really furious and be like, what are you doing?
And you'd say, he's a clear and present danger.
Right. I'd have to argue that either you were somehow going to scandalize the community by taking communion, or that somehow you take communion was going to go ahead. Oh, and by the way, it's needlessly scandalized. So there is even a case in which he could say, well, she's going to scandalize it, but it's a good thing. Needlessly scandalized. I need to be precise with that. Or that somehow you taking communion was a clear and present danger to yourself or the person next to you. Which I don't even begin to come up with a scenario in which that could even be possible.
I guess in this day and age, it could be that you had COVID.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what?
I said, in this day and age, the only possible thing might be you have COVID and you know it, and you're meeting in a group.
That's fair. I hadn't thought of that.
True.
That would be clear. You could argue a clear and present. I don't know if you'd win the argument, but you could, I guess, argue a clear and present danger. Like if someone said, I have COVID, I tested positive, and I'm coming into this meeting because it ain't real or something like that. You could probably remove someone from membership. I will have to play with that thought experiment for a while and get back to you.
I have to give you something to think about.
No, I love this sort of stuff. These are the sorts of things that when I wake up really early in the morning and I'm drinking my coffee before my little ones get up and start like pulling on me in 1,000 different directions, my brain chews on.
Yeah, that just brought back the whole 80s, late 70s AIDS, HIV.
Mhm.
Yeah, no,
Silliness.
right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and I'll
See,
tell you, talking about AIDS, HIV, there is growing number of colleagues I'm talking to across the US who are pastors. Okay. We have all these little pastor groups. You all hang out and chat with each other about what's going on in your neck of the woods, especially with coronavirus going on. How are things out in San Diego? How are things out in Seattle? Those sorts of things. And we're all running across similar stories that we're either experiencing or hearing of lots of families asking funeral directors to switch cause of death in obituaries from coronavirus to something else. Which a lot of these sort of older, wiser pastors have been like, man, we haven't seen anything like that since the early days of AIDS.
Yeah.
And as pastors, we're trying to figure out what to do with that. Like, because you don't want to fight a family on what they put in an obituary. That seems horrible. At the same time, everyone who denies that someone died of it allows people to pretend that it doesn't exist more. You know what I mean?
I guess I have I'm familiar with the obituaries where the cause of death wasn't listed, and it was sort of I wish you had told me because I said the wrong thing because I didn't know.
Yeah.
Versus the people assume, so now you have rumor. It's messy.
Yeah.
And I guess I fall back to, I remember being in a conference room. I had just moved up to Michigan, and I was in a conference room and there was a conversation going on, and it quickly eroded into a very deep hole of AIDS and HIV and joking about it. And I was the older person in the room.
Yeah.
And I remember having to stand up and basically say, you know what, I just can't anymore. My best friend just passed.
Yeah.
And a guy from my wedding party, and he got it from a blood transfusion. And I don't know anything else more about Vic other than I know we lost him and it was very sad. But I remember the one team member coming to my desk an hour later on his knees asking forgiveness because he really didn't get it until I said what I said. And so it's kind of like, yeah, you need to just accept, because none of it had anything to do with whether or not the person could be in the pew next to me or in the desk next to me.
Absolutely. Hey, I'm going to go ahead and just turn off the recording because we're at the hour mark. No need to apologize. I'm just going to say, hey, folks, if you're watching this online later, I'm cutting the recording now, but the conversation for those who are here, please keep doing. I'm just letting you know I'm stopping the recording, which means you can now use, more colorful language.